Music is everywhere in America. You turn on the TV, turn on the radio, you hear classical, rock, pop, jazz, country, many different types of music. But what if I told you that the music that is the American icon was not always our icon? Hello, my name is Thomas Sparks, and today I will be talking about the advancement of music in America throughout the past century. Now, today I'm going to be taking you through a chronological look at the 20th century and how music has evolved since obviously, the 1900s. But before I even start there, we're going to have a little historical context, and then we'll finally wrap it up with what music is today. So as I said before, we're going to go ahead and start with a little historical context. Now, thanks to the Themes for Brotherhood book from the Phi Mu Alpha Sinfonia Fraternity, which was given to me through my probationary process, they gave me a little glimpse at what music was like in America before the 20th century. In the late 1800s, or the late 19th century, European musicians were considered higher than American musicians. Even though we had American conservatories of music here, lots of American students were denied because most of the professors were European and thought less of the American students. But when some Americans somehow did get lucky enough to get in, the European students would do things to try and sabotage them. For instance, the European piano players would put razor blades between the keyboards, and when you sit down and play a chord, fingers all cut up, and that could potentially ruin your career. Now, even though it's a little bit of a gruesome past, music will overcome with American tradition. According to history, I'm going to go ahead and now move into the 1900s, specifically the 1910s, where according to HistoryJazz.com, lots of the music in America started in the streets of New Orleans with Dixieland jazz. A lot of this happened too because of the simple 12-bar blues form, which is a very simple form of music that takes very little skill to be able to pick up. You just have to know how to play your instrument, have a pretty decent ear. I was able to pick up on this form when I was in 7th grade. Most people do it when they're about, I don't know, like 8 or 10 sometimes. It's pretty incredible. Eventually, this form would be taken by Louis Armstrong to Harlem of New York, and it would explode from there, creating the big band era. In the 1920s and 30s, with band leaders such as Duke Ellington and Count Basie, you would have a 20-person ensemble playing in the different jazz clubs on Friday and Saturday nights. Now, along with this too, a lot of American classical composers were starting to rise up, such as George and Ira Gershwin, two brothers. Now, a lot of the American classical music had a lot of jazz inflection, and a lot of the American jazz music had a lot of classical inflection with it. Now, why was this? Because, according to some rumors that I've heard in the past, George Gershwin and Duke Ellington, from two different genres, would hang out at the bars after playing on a Saturday night. Pretty incredible, right? Eventually, this big band era would last up until about, I would say, like the 1940s, especially with the draft of the war. Many musicians were starting to be drafted off, and they had to resort to creating smaller combos, usually about from a trio to about a 10-person ensemble. But a lot of the music scenes started happening now on the West Coast with the quote-unquote cool jazz era with artists such as Miles Davis and Jerry Mulligan and Dave Brubeck. Eventually from this era, we start to see more guitar-oriented groups, where you'd have the guitar, bass, drums, usually keyboard player, maybe a brass player as well, and we start getting more vocal and getting more used to the 12-bar blues form with rock and roll in the 1950s. Now, this would eventually evolve into the experimental rock in the 1960s with the help of magical drugs such as LSD and marijuana, and eventually we started having backing tracks of electronic sounds, which Pink Floyd is one of the most renowned artists for using the electronic sounds in experimental rock. 1970, we start to get more disco, 80s, heavy metal and pop rock, and eventually in the 1990s, we start to move into more rap, R&B, and soul. Now, along with this too, I'm also going to be talking about the music industry and the technologies that went behind it. See, there were two major record companies that really pushed everything forward, and without them, the artists wouldn't have been able to get their sound out there. Now, at first, it was pretty decently hard to try and get the sound out to the public because vinyl records were not that accessible to most people. But eventually, they started getting cheaper and cheaper, and more people were able to buy more records and start having entire libraries of them. Eventually, from there, we would get the 8-track in about the late 60s, early 70s, and eventually move from there to the cassette, and then now we have CDs, which this has about 10 songs on it, and then now we have digital music, which this has, I think, somewhere over 1,000 songs on it. Pretty incredible how technology has overcome in the past century, especially with music. Now, looking at today's music, a lot of the times you will see digital music has really taken over, where people can buy individual songs rather than buying entire albums. which it can kind of hurt the producers because the CDs were the main moneymaker. Because you could put a bunch of songs on there that people usually wouldn't even listen to, because if you remember, if you were a 90s kid, you go to the store and buy a CD just to hear one, maybe two songs. Also, the modern artists have a very interesting way of being able to spread new ideas of music. I was fortunate enough to be able to play and personally know modern jazz pianist and citizen of the world, Jonathan Batiste. And Jonathan Batiste coined the term of today's music as being social music, because with the help of social media sites such as Facebook, SoundCloud, and World Star Hip Hop even, more musical ideas are being able to be spread even faster, at the speed of light almost. You have artists such as Avicii taking the original country blues-oriented rock and mixing it with heavy bass-driven beats and modern techno riffs going over the top. Because of this, we start to have more ideas come out and more things such as electro jazz and electro swing becoming more popular genres. Also, one interesting thing that a lot of people have started to notice, which you might notice if you read the titles on your iPods, you'll have a song by artists such as Fancy by Iggy, but it'll say in parentheses featuring Charlie XCX, is it? Yeah, thanks, Dana. And a lot of people think this is a very common practice where artists will bring in an artist and feature them on a certain album or a song. Whereas this is a very ancient practice as well. According to Mark Levine's biography on Charlie Parker was first picked up by Dizzy Gillespie in the 1920s, 30s, somewhere within that era. And then he eventually moved on to do his own solo career. And from general background knowledge, Miles Davis was picked up by Charlie Parker. And then Miles went on to push Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, and Bill Evans, many of the jazz giants. Essentially, modern music in America has become a family tree. Now, in conclusion, I've given you just a very, very brief overlook of the advancement of music in America within the past century, making music America's icon and gift to the world. I know I focused heavily on jazz, but Hugh Laurie said on the Colbert Report that jazz is America's gift to the world. So next time you turn on the radio, you just might be thinking, hey, this is something that's formed from over 100 years of tradition. Thank you for your time.